Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started into Ezekiel chapter 1. Let me grab my clicker. Do this again here. All right, Dustin and Tosin have handouts. For today's class. So I'm hoping there's enough. If not, maybe somebody can do me a favor and make some copies in the back. But one word about the handouts. You'll notice they're hole punched. The one I gave you on Wednesday was also hole punched. Up here on the front, everyone may not want to do this, so I'm leaving it up to you. But if you'd like a folder to put these hole punched handouts in, there's a great big stack of them up here. I don't want to necessarily pass them out because I know not everyone's going to use them. But if you'd like to keep track of your handouts in a nice 3-pronged folder with pockets on either side in bright yellow and green, then they're up here. So send somebody up here to get one now or come and get one after class. Sorry, Mike. And grab one whenever. They'll be I'll put them back in the workroom on one of the shelves later on if you think of it or want to grab one. But get a folder if you'd like, but the handout hopefully will be useful regardless. And we're going to jump into Ezekiel chapter 1. And that was a rush. Now I feel like I should have just passed them out. But it does match your outfit nicely, Sharon. Yeah, no distraction up here. Yeah. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 1. Here's the objectives for today's class, and if we can finish in time, then we'll come back to these and see how you did. The first 3 chapters of Ezekiel that we're starting into this morning is Ezekiel's call. Each of the prophets, at some point, the major prophets were told they were called by God to serve as a prophet. That's going to happen here, the opening of the book of Ezekiel. And so hopefully by the end of the class, you can explain why Ezekiel was called at this particular time, according to the dates given to us in the first chapter. But the biggest thing in chapter 1 is this weird vision that Ezekiel sees. And so we're going to spend most of our time on that. Hopefully by the end of the class, you can identify 2 or 3 big ideas. That is, not small, minuscule details, but big ideas that are being communicated in Ezekiel's vision that are relevant to his message. And then, hopefully be able to connect this strange passage to at least one other Bible passage in the Old or in the New Testament. Okay? That's our objectives, and let's jump into chapter 1. Here's what I want us to do. Let's read the whole thing. Read the entire vision, at least as what's given to us in chapter 1. What Mike did for us at the Lord's table this morning actually is a fitting tie-in to this lesson. This vision is weird in Ezekiel 1, but one of the things that's true about the Bible in general, but especially passages like this, is to remember that these words were originally written down to be read aloud and heard. Okay? And oftentimes, with a passage like this, with these apocalyptic visions, we may say, like in Ezekiel chapter 1, we have a tendency to dissect and to get into the weeds of every paw and every claw, as someone likes to say. And I just don't think that's what we're intended to do with these visions. They were intended to be heard, and then, as Mike led us this morning, to be visualized, to see these in our mind's eye. And yes, I have some pictures, okay, because I know that's why everybody came this morning. But I really think that actually the pictures are a little bit of a missing the point, because these are not visions intended to be mapped out exactly the way everything was looking, okay? They're visions that are intended to be imagined and to be seen in the mind's eye, and to be seen as a whole. And so, to that end, I want us to just read the entire chapter, and then I'm going to have you guys talk amongst yourselves about what you think you see and hear in terms of what's being communicated to Ezekiel. What are the principles that God is trying to communicate to Ezekiel by showing him all this weird stuff? So you can close your eyes as you did earlier for Mike's talk, or you can look at your Bible or just listen. But this is Ezekiel chapter 1. Now it came about in the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was by the river Kebar among the exiles, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th month of the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kabar, and there the hand of the Lord came upon him. Verse 4, and I looked, behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it, and in its midst something like glowing metal in the midst of the fire. Within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. They had human form. Each of them had 4 faces, 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on the 4 sides were human hands. As for the faces and wings of the 4 of them, their wings touched one another. Their faces did not turn when they moved. Each went straight forward. As for the form of their faces, each had the face of a man. All 4 had the face of a lion on the right, the face of a bull on the left, and all 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each had 2 touching another being, and 2 covering their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit was about to go, they would go, without turning as they went. In the midst of the 4 living beings, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches darting back and forth among the living beings. The fire was bright, lightning was flashing from the fire, and the living beings ran to and fro like bolts of lightning. Now as I looked at the living beings, behold, there was one wheel on the earth beside the living beings, for each of the 4 of them. The appearance of the wheels and their workmanship was like sparkling beryl, and all 4 of them had the same form, their appearance and workmanship being as if one wheel were within another. Whenever they moved in any of the 4 directions, without turning as they moved. As for their rims, they were lofty and awesome, and the rims of all 4 of them were full of eyes round about. Whenever the living beings moved, the wheels moved with them, and whenever the living beings rose from the earth, the wheels rose also. Wherever the Spirit was about to go, they would go in that direction, and the wheels rose close behind them, for the Spirit of the living beings was in the wheels. Whenever they went, these went. Whenever they stood still, these stood still. Whenever they rose from the earth, the wheels rose close beside them, for the Spirit of the living beings was in the wheels. Now over the heads of the living beings there was something like an expanse, like the awesome gleam of crystal spread out over their heads. Under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight one toward another. Each one had 2 wings covering its body on the one side and on the other. I also heard the sound of their wings like the sound of abundant waters as they went, like the voice of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army camp. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings. And there came a voice from the expanse that was over their heads. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings. Now above the expanse that was over their heads was something resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance, and on that which resembled a throne high up was a figure with the appearance of a man. And I noticed from his appearance of his loins and upward something like glowing metal that looked like fire all around within it. And from the appearance of his loin downward I saw something like fire. There was radiance around him. As the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. Such was the appearance of the likeness, the glory of God. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking. Okay, talks amongst yourselves. Like I said, don't get into the weeds, but just think big ideas here. This is what Ezekiel saw. The question I want you to discuss with each other is, what attributes of God are coming across as you hear and see this vision in its entirety? Talk for a few minutes and then we'll share out all together. Oh, there you go. Action Bible. I should have got that Lego Bible out. That's today? Fitting for Ezekiel 1. It's 2 in the weeds, Mike. 2 in the weeds. That's 2 in the weeds. These are big things. You don't have to be an expert in symbolism or in, ancient Near East culture or iconography or anything to, I think, to look at this and say, what do you learn about God? What's being communicated to God, about God to Ezekiel in this vision? All-knowing, all-seeing, Mike says. Terry, what you got?
It was a special vision. Yeah, it was a special vision from God that he was fixing to be told. He was actually being called a prophet, but that was the whole thing about the vision that he saw: the wheels, the 4 creatures, their faces, everything. And as we read further into the book of Ezekiel, it's repeated. So it's no one could imagine it on their own.
Terry says he's being called as a prophet, and what he's seeing here is clearly not an ordinary vision. Thank you, Terry. Other big ideas about God from the vision jump out to you. Rick and then Albert?
Yeah, obviously, it says at the end it's meant to inspire our sense of glory, that God is glory. The throne is there to indicate that he's ruling, but the overall vision is meant to inspire awe and wonder of what God is all about, in the sense that here comes the message, pay attention, here's the one that's sending it to you.
Okay, so big words: glory, awe, wonder, and ruling, the reign of God with the throne. Yes, Albert?
God's not constrained or limited to the natural laws. I mean, you have rainbow and fire in the same vision. You have these wheels that are going in 4 different directions but not moving, and then you have wings and hands. So God is not limited by laws of nature.
God is not constrained by laws of nature. Thank you, Albert. Robert?
I was just thinking that that the vision that Ezekiel sees was meant to make sure Ezekiel knew this was God, but also that it was so complicated that they couldn't create a image and worship it.
And so Robert says, clear that it's God, but so complicated that you couldn't recreate it to worship it. Thank you, Robert. Other big ideas about God, attributes of God from the vision. Got some big words out here. All-knowing, all-seeing, out of the ordinary, clearly not of man, glory, awe, wonder, reigning, outside, not constrained, complex and yet obvious. Okay, I think honestly, this kind of stuff that we're talking about now, I think that's the track we're supposed to be going down when we read a passage like Ezekiel 1. But we can talk about some of the details if you'd like. I'm sure you would. But this, I think, is the big stuff that's being communicated, and probably you could already tick off your second objective for today's class, just like that. Before we get to the vision, let's just briefly touch on these first 3 verses. Ezekiel 1:1 says, "It came about in the 30th year on the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was by the river Kibar among the exiles." So, the 30th year of what? It's been debated as everything is, but most likely this is the 30th year of Ezekiel's life. Okay, not typically the way that this is said, but there is one other example in Genesis where this same sort of construction is used. But this is probably Ezekiel's 30th birthday. Not exactly, but it's he's just turned 30 recently. Okay, and the reason that's important is that according to the book of Numbers, the 30th year for a priest would be the year that he would enter into the temple and begin his service. Jordan, actually, you were right, Jordan. Jordan said on Wednesday, I think Ezekiel was a priest. And Ezekiel was a priest. In a sense, it calls him a priest here, but this is the irony of the first 3 verses of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a priest. Maybe most accurately, he's the son of a priest. Okay, it's his 30th year, so he's ready to enter temple service. And yet what? What's Ezekiel's reality? He's not in Jerusalem, and he can't serve in the temple. The temple's actually not going to be around much longer. But even now, as the temple still stands, Ezekiel's not there. He is exiled into Babylon. Okay, so you can imagine that even just very personally for Ezekiel, that this would be a difficult thing to swallow, right? As he's been in exile for a few years, but now he knows this would have been the time for him to start his work as a priest, but he's in exile. And so instead of being called to serve as a priest in his 30th year, instead God calls Ezekiel here to be a prophet. And this is the time that he appears to Ezekiel and he sees visions of God, and he will be called in chapters 2 and 3 to speak God's word to the people. Okay? Any comments or questions on the first 3 verses? Yeah, Robert.
I'm just reflecting, based on chapter 9, Ezekiel wouldn't want to be in the temple.
Sure.
That he's able to better worship God from where he is than he would be there.
And so that idea of, is the temple where God's dwelling? We're going to talk about that as Robert points out. What's actually going on in the temple? Where Ezekiel can actually worship God. All that I think is connected to like what Albert said, God not being constrained. A lot of these themes are present here in the opening of Ezekiel. We're supposed to pay attention to that. Okay? All right, starting in verse 4, the first 3 verses are essentially verse 1 is in the first person. Verse 2 and 3 are a side to place ourselves here in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile. But then in verse 4, we pick back up in the first person, and the rest of Ezekiel will be told in the first person. Actually makes it unique in that sense as well. But he starts to see the vision starting in verse 4. So let's break it up into 3 sections. The first thing we are exposed to here in Ezekiel 1 are the living creatures. And one thing that's helpful, and Terry mentioned this, that this vision continues to reappear throughout the early chapters of Ezekiel. When you get to chapter 10 of Ezekiel, several times throughout that chapter, it refers to these creatures that are underneath or carrying the throne of God, just like what we see here in Ezekiel 1, refers to them as we would say cherubim or the cherubim. Okay, it doesn't name them that in Ezekiel 1, but that's I think what we're supposed to be thinking of when we think of these living creatures. They are the cherubim. Now you could do a Google search or a Bible search and find all the places that these are referenced. I'll give you a few important references. The cherubim first show up in Genesis chapter 3 when, as we said this morning, the humans are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. It's the cherubim that are guarding the entrance so that they can't get back in, flaming sword and all that in Genesis chapter 3. But maybe more to what's being depicted in Ezekiel chapter 1, remember that on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was in the most holy place. This was to symbolize the very place where God was dwelling. So we know God's with his people. We know God dwells in the tabernacle, but it's like the holy of holy place. That's the point of calling it that. That's like where God is dwelling. That's the target of his presence. And it's in or on the Ark of the Covenant, which is carried around like a throne might be carried around and has on top of it cherubim with their wings stretching out and touching each other. I do have a picture of that here in just a second. But it symbolizes the place where God sits, which is a lot of what's going on in Ezekiel chapter 1. And then probably because of that, because the Ark of the Covenant had those cherubim on top of it with the mercy seat, and that represented God's sitting place among his people, likely because of that, a lot of places in the Old Testament talk about God as being enthroned on the cherubim. Okay, so I think what the people are doing is they're seeing the symbolism of the Ark of the Covenant, and they're saying the reality, the symbolism mirrors the reality, that God is enthroned in the midst of these amazing, terrifying, angelic creatures that are called cherubim. Okay, but again, this is important to Ezekiel 1 because what we're seeing here is the cherubim that are moving around, transporting a throne. And so you see that it parallels to the Ark of the Covenant and to the way of talking about God as enthroned on the cherubim. But the weird thing about these creatures is the fact that they are what we call composite creatures. They have all kind of faces combined, right? Man's face, they kind of look like a man, but they got an ox face and a lion's face and an eagle's face. What in the world is going on? Again, just kind of sticking with the basics here. The idea is that when you have a composite creature, you are taking the attributes, what we're supposed to be focusing on, you're supposed to take the attributes of each of these creatures, these qualities of each animal, and you're piling them on top of each other to come up with, an amazing animal that's better than any of them on their own. Does that make sense? In fact, one person said, so there's man, lion, ox, eagle. I read one that I kind of like this idea. Man, of course, the highest creature in all creation. The lion is the highest of the wild animals. The ox is the highest of the domesticated animals. And the eagle is the highest bird, was the idea there. Okay, but we could probably go on from that and have our own discussion about, for instance, what would an ox symbolize? Why would you like having an ox as your symbol? Strength, right? Why would you like having a eagle as your symbol? Because we're Americans, Albert says. Albert, just leave. Just get out. I thought someone at least might say freedom, and it's like, well, yeah. But eagle, vision, Jordan says, okay? And lion. Courage, there we go. Wizard of Oz, right? Courage of the lion. And some of all these overlap. You know, you come up with attributes that these animals share. But the human aspect of it might bring in what? Intelligence, okay? Knowledge, right? There is a connection here between these beings and the world of man. They are not so totally other that they have no connection to us. They're beings like we are. We share some sort of form or image with them. And so they have the appearance of a man, but these other beings in here bring in other attributes, okay? And what are they doing just in these verses, up to verse 14, especially towards the end of this, 12 to 14 maybe in particular? What kind of activity are these creatures involved in? They are moving around furiously. And I think, if anything, that's it right there. It says that in the midst of them, there's this like burning coals that are like darting back and forth. It's kind of wild, okay? No still image of this is going to capture that for sure, okay? It says that the fire was bright, lightning flashing from the fire. Verse 14, the living beings ran to and fro like bolts of lightning. Can you envision that? That's pretty awesome, okay? They are moving, and they are moving quickly and intensely and with purposeful movement. Because of the four faces, right, they never have to turn. You saw that in there. We'll see that idea again. But with the four faces, the all-knowing, the all-seeing aspect, right, and they can move, and they always can move straight ahead and purposefully without ever turning one way or the other, okay? All right, anything on these living creatures? I got a couple more things on that, but we'll stop here. The living creatures. Mike? Okay.
What's the symbolism of them darting back and forth so quickly in all directions? I mean, the other stuff we could say the power and the strength and, all that, but this darting back and forth like lightning, any ideas from anybody on kind of what that is pointing towards?
Yeah. Well, he said anybody, so I'll open it first to others if there are other ideas on that. Active, Jordan says. Greg? God is everywhere. They move, Felicity points out the language of moving wherever the Spirit wants them to go, okay? And I think that's it. So, Mike, your question is great because with this vision, again, God is trying to make himself known to Ezekiel. How in the world can the all-powerful God make himself known? Because there's all these kind of conundrums about God. So, for instance, this vision is intended, as we've said, to depict God moving, right? He's like coming in on his throne. But isn't that a little bit silly to say that God is moving from this place to this place? Because does God have to move from one place to the other? No, he's everywhere. But yet there is this idea of God moving. So it's almost like the movement of the darting back and forth makes me think it's a way of expressing that God is everywhere all at the same time, okay? But he has this aspect of movement and activity as well. That's right. There you go. There you go.
But really it's spot to spot, but
Perfect, yeah.
But it looks like it's everywhere.
Yeah, I was thinking that's a good analogy. And I was thinking of like the atoms in this podium here are literally moving incredibly fast, bouncing up against each other. But to us, it looks like it's just still solid. But your analogy is better now that I expressed mine. So go with Mike on that one. Okay. All right, a couple things I do think are important to see. By the way, here's a representation. It's so hard to find a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant in which the poles are on this direction. Okay, but I think this is the right way because it's supposed to depict the carrying of a king's throne and the mercy seat being on top between the cherubim. Okay, this is the way that it would have been carried. Okay, but you see this idea. So you can see that the Israelites familiar with this conception of the Ark of the Covenant, how it fits with this vision of the reality of God or something approximating the reality of God's movement comes from this idea of the Ark of the Covenant. See that connection there, okay? But here's another connection that I want to make, okay? We talked about the Assyrians, the big bad Assyrians that reigned for 2 centuries in the ancient Near East as the world power. This is from the palace of Sargon II, the same time period. And this is a depiction of one of their gods. What do you notice? It's a composite creature, okay? And I show you this really just to make this point, that the composite nature of these creatures in Ezekiel 1 is the weirdest thing to us about these visions. But I want us to see that to Ezekiel and to the people that he would have been communicating with, it would not have been weird at all, okay? They were familiar, and I could have given you tons of other examples from around the ancient Near East of composite creatures. As they envisioned something powerful, of course, their gods were not real. But as they tried to envision something powerful, the way that they envisioned that was by putting together the things they knew in creation that had their own power and glory and stuffing them all together. Like the Sphinx, right, in Egypt, okay? This was how they conceptualized it, and there were images of this all over the place. And so God does this from time to time. He's borrowing from the way they would have thought about things, and he's saying, okay, well, let me show you the reality. Let me show you my real power and my real glory. By the way, one interesting distinction here is in Ezekiel 1, the composite creature is not God himself, right? The composite creatures are what? They're the angels. Yeah, they're the servants, okay? And so God is something even, beyond that, of course, okay? But this is just to say that for them, it would not have been strange to combine the elements. And again, it probably helps us. No one looks at this, this carving here from the palace of Sargon and says, but I wonder what the wings represent, I wonder what the modern day analogy is. What modern nation in Europe is the hooves there, No, they didn't do that. They were familiar just with the basic idea of a composite creature that reflects the power, the glory of these various animals, all put into one as the best way to try to imagine something that has the vision, the knowledge, the power, the glory, the strength that they're going for. And so the cherubim, the living creatures in Ezekiel 1, are exactly that, moving all back and forth, connected as 4 points of this square here. All right? Then the wheels, another strange element to this vision. Wheels within a wheel. How are we supposed to see that? Again, I'll give you some depictions in a minute if you're having a hard time visualizing it. But I think even with this one, this phrase, maybe above all the phrases in this chapter, a wheel within a wheel, you can just tell Ezekiel is just trying his best to tell us what it looks like, but he really can't tell us what it looks like. What does he mean, a wheel within a wheel? Okay. Now, we think maybe a wheel and a smaller wheel. I don't know. I think the idea is probably like two wheels this way. Can't even really do it. But, perpendicular, I almost said parallel, perpendicular to each other, wheels that way. Because what's the idea? They could go in any direction without turning. And this fits with the faces of the four living creatures. A face in each direction, wheel within a wheel, okay? It can move, multi-directional movement, which gets back, I think, to the basic idea that we were talking about with Mike earlier, and the ability to move everywhere as needed. And what is within, not just wheels within a wheel, but what is also on the wheels? Eyes. What's the point of that? Know where they're going? Why so many? Yeah, Michael said, but why so many, right? Wouldn't one do, It's like cars today have like cameras like on every single point of the car. It's like, why do you need that many cameras? What happened to like looking out the windshield and being able to tell where you're backing up, right? Sorry. Why so many eyes? See everywhere, right? And that's the idea. We talked about the idea of vision before. There's probably one in the Old Testament, which would some ways be better because I would like to kind of hold off on some of the New Testament stuff till later. But remember in the book of Revelation that when Jesus is pictured, actually, he is full of eyes. Where is that? That was in Revelation 4 and 5. Or maybe it's not. Let's see. You're like, should have done this before class, right? Okay, I'll give up on it in a second. But full of eyes. Yeah, there we go. 7 eyes. 7 horns and 7 eyes. A depiction of Jesus as the Lamb in Revelation 5. 7 horns and 7 eyes. And so the abundance of eyes means the vision of God. He can see everywhere, all-knowing, can be everywhere at one time, can see everything at one time. And as we've already mentioned, the wheels and the creatures go together. So we're probably seeing the wheels as being like underneath the creatures, I guess. And as they move, they all move together. And there's this phrase in here that the Spirit, they moved wherever the Spirit went, or wherever the Spirit decided or willed or whatever. My New American Standard doesn't actually capitalize the word Spirit. Remember, that's something that we have to do ourselves. In the Hebrew text, there's no way of, capital S or not. It's just the word Spirit. So we have to decide, is this God's Spirit animating all of this? And I'm going to go ahead and say that it is, or at least if not, it's that's basic idea. But the idea is that they're all connected and they're in unanimous movement as they go from place to place. Anything on the wheels? Yeah, Sharon. Right. Yeah. So there's the connection, definitely the connection between the Spirit and the wheels. Okay. And so then the question becomes, the Spirit of the living beings, is that the same as the Spirit of God? So the way I'm picturing it is that the Spirit of God is animating all of it. The Spirit of God is animating the creatures as they move here and there, and that same Spirit is also animating the wheels as it moves around. But it could be, as maybe Sharon's pointing out, that this is simply just the living creatures are moving, and it's their Spirit that's moving the wheels. I'm fine with that too. Okay, any other things on the wheel or anything through verse 21? Okay. So we have creatures, we have wheels, they're moving around, and what's on top of them? Well, interested in the different words. What are the different translations for the word in verse 22? Mine says there was something like an expanse. Any different word there in verse 22? Firmament. I think the idea is that what's being pictured here is a big platform, okay? Because on the platform there's a throne. But I think one of the reasons for saying that it's an expanse or it's a firmament is, one, to show you the scale of it, okay? This isn't just like some little platform. This is like the expanse. That's how big, how majestic, how far-reaching it is, okay? But also, anybody, that word remind you of any other Bible passage when we talk about the expanse or the firmament? That's creation language, right? And there's several other things like that here in Ezekiel 1. We're intended to take our minds back to Genesis chapter 1 and to the creation itself. And so above the living creatures there is an expanse, but what you see here as the text goes on is that the creatures are transporting God's throne. So a platform, the expanse, and then on top of it, a throne. Thrones were, of course, stationary, big fancy chair that a king would sit in, but there also were thrones that would move around. When a king goes out to battle, he has his royal chariot, and so that would be like a mobile throne we might think of. And so the idea here, when you talk about wheels, you're talking about the idea of a chariot and moving this throne all around. I was going to just read you this connection as well. Alex referenced this passage in Exodus 24 a couple months ago in his Lord's Supper talk. There's this interesting passage in Exodus 24 where the people, not all the people, but the elders of Israel with Aaron and Moses and Nadab and Abihu get to go up on the mountain and eat with God. And the text says this, it says that Moses, is Exodus 24 verse 9, Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, the 70 elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. They saw God and they ate and drank. So you see another instance there where God is descending just low enough for the elders of Israel to get a glimpse of him. And what do they see? Well, they see his feet. That's about all that he allows them to see. But what is his feet resting on? It says pavement of sapphire. I think we're seeing the same idea of Ezekiel 1 here. As he sits on his throne on this platform that is the heavens itself, right? It is the expanse. It is the firmament that carries his throne, right? But with all this glory and all this majesty, we see the expanse, we hear the amazing sound of the wings as well as the voice of God, and on it is a throne, and we finally get this glimpse in verse 26, and God is in the appearance of what? I heard like murmurs, but... this is right here. Stop right here, by the way. By the way, just another connection, familiar ideas. This is a throne chair from ancient Egypt, and do you notice anything about the throne? What it has on it? Well, I'm not sure if those were added on later. That's like those felt pads, it's like, man, the Egyptians were really advanced. They had those felt pads to put under furniture, I'm not sure there's wheels on this, but what do you see? Feet, wings, faces of lion. You see that the king of Egypt is like sitting on these composite creatures. You see winged creatures at the arms here, lion head, I'm assuming, and then feet of some sort on the bottom here, right? So again, these were not totally foreign ideas to them. They understood this idea of a picture of a king enthroned on symbols of power and strength and glory and all that. So anyway, for what it's worth, not what we were talking about. God is in the appearance of a man. Why in the world would God appear to Ezekiel and have the appearance of a man? So Michael says that because man is made in God's image, right? Which I think is it. And it reminds us we have to go in the right direction, okay? Remember the idols of the nations that we've seen some examples of already, right? The gods of the nations were made in the image of man. Man envisioned, what do I want God to be like? And they fashioned God in their image. Okay? But we were made in God's image. And so when we see, when God reveals himself with a likeness of a man, the point is not, oh, God's just like us. It's, oh yeah, we were made to be like God. We were made in his image. We were made with a connection to him. Yeah, Mike? That's right.
And will do us harm. So he had to work it some way to where we could see that image like you're talking about.
Which is a perfect segue to this here, okay? According to the text of Ezekiel 1, does Ezekiel see the Lord in this chapter? Does Ezekiel see the glory of the Lord in this chapter? Not what I read. Does Ezekiel see the likeness of the glory of the Lord? Not what I read in my Bible. It says in verse 28, Ezekiel says, such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. That's like 3 steps removed from seeing God, okay? This is not, he didn't see God. No man, as Mike said, can see God and live, okay? But Ezekiel is like even distancing himself even more and saying, it was like kind of like sort of the way you might think of what the glory of God would look like, okay? It's just, to me, is an amazing verse. And yet, in spite of that, 3-4 layers removed, or, steps from seeing God, what was his reaction? Hit the ground, man. And fall on your face and be humbled by what you have seen, okay? But this is to Mike's point. Verse 28 reminds us that we are supposed to take from this vision all the majesty, all the wonder, all of the attributes of God, his royalty. He is throned on all of the powers of the universe. He sits enthroned on top of all of them. And he is above the expanse, enthroned above the cherubim, and he is everywhere at the same time. He sees everything at all times, and he can move everywhere with purpose and intent and intensity in the flash of lights, okay? We're supposed to see all of that and get all of that from Ezekiel's vision. And yet, as maybe Robert reminded us at the very beginning, we're not supposed to take from this, oh yeah, this is what God looks like. This is the image of God. No, this is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Okay? That's what Ezekiel saw. Even that much brings him to the ground, face to the ground. And a voice begins to speak at the end of chapter 1, and we'll hear what the voice has to say in chapter 2 and 3 when God begins to call Ezekiel as his prophet. But a few minutes left, and we are back to, oh yeah, the pictures I promised you. Raphael, remember one of the Ninja Turtles of the Italian Renaissance? This is the famous painting from Raphael. Raphael had skill as an artist. I'm not so sure he knew how to read his Bible. When I look at it, I'm like, what were you reading? What translation did you have? But anyway, cherubim, hopefully we've established cherubim are not the cute, cuddly babies, okay? You see a cherubim, you want to hit the ground and die, okay? Not seeing a cute little kid like this. But it's Raphael, so I've got to show it to you. Here's another depiction from a little bit before. This is from the late Middle Ages here, but you see the illustration here. Probably getting it closer. They've gone for a round platform here. But you see the living creatures with the wheels as they move around the earth, full of eyes and all of that. And that seems to at least get the basic idea more or less correct, as I understand it. And then Anita was talking about the Bible Project. Go watch the Bible Project's 2-part summary of Ezekiel. That will help you, I think, understand the book. And this is a screenshot from the upper left-hand corner of their little outline. That is their quick rendition of what this will look like. They're not going for detail or for style necessarily, but what I do want to capture with this image here is that this is the concept of it. All the stuff going on in Ezekiel 1, what's the basic concept? It's God's mobile throne moving to Ezekiel, actually, in Babylon, which is interesting of itself, okay? So this is the basic conception. All right, who can tell me why Ezekiel was called in the particular time that he was called? 30, he turned 30, which meant time to serve as a priest, so he's called as a prophet. Who can give me one big idea from Ezekiel's vision? God is there. Another big idea. God is all-knowing. Thank you, Christy. And then what's one other Bible passage you would connect to Ezekiel? We probably didn't do enough of this, but another Bible passage that connects to Ezekiel 1? Genesis 3:24, the cherubim in the Garden of Eden. Revelation 5, John? Oh, you're just saying it's time to go. Okay. Another one I meant to mention is Isaiah 6, because Isaiah is parallel to Ezekiel a glorious vision of God as a way to humble him and then send him on his way as a prophet. So Isaiah 6 would be another connection. Okay, I kept you a few minutes over. I owe you. Absolutely. Let's say a prayer for Bob as we close our class. Our dear Father, we lift up again a petition to you. We have been reminded this morning of your glory and your greatness, your power. You are all-knowing and you are everywhere at the same time, and yet you move to act for those of your people who are in need in the flash of light. And so we beg of you now that you would be with Bob as he's on his way to the hospital. Watch over Bob Stark and that heart that you have blessed him with, and we pray that the doctors will be able to figure out immediately and attend to his needs, and that you would keep him safe, watch over him and protect him. Be with Irma as she cares for him and worries about him and the entire family. We love you, God. We recognize your power and your wisdom far above our own, but we plead for you because you've commanded to us to do so, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, see everybody at 1:30.